Hi, good evening. Thank you for joining us. We're just waiting for more of you to trickle in. And before we start, I just want to say a few words on behalf of the board of London Art Week that I'm a member of. My name is Emanuela Tarizzo, and we'd all like to thank you very much for joining us for the third and final panel of our winter symposium. To those of you who joined us on Monday and Tuesday, thank you. And those of you who couldn't make it, all of the panels will be available as recordings on our YouTube channel in January. So, you should be receiving an email once they're live and available. And as many of you know, this is part of the Jewish Country Houses project. This is a 4-year Arts and Humanities Research Council funded project run out of the University of Oxford in partnership with the National Trust and in collaboration with the Gilbert Collection. Within the project, research on the theme of the Jewish art collections has been led by historian Thomas Stammers, who's associate professor at Durham University, and curator Silvia Davoli from the Strawberry Hill Trust. Now, they have organized a series of workshops on the subject, and we are delighted that for the public program, they have decided to partner with London Art Week. And our topic today is the heritage of Jewish art dealerships in 19th and 20th century London. And our moderator, art critic and writer Tom Marks, is going to now introduce our speakers. Thank you.
Thanks, Emanuela. And thank you to London Art Week for inviting me to chair this panel. As Emanuela says, my name's Tom Marks, and actually, I feel quite appropriately, I'm sitting at the moment in the Warburg Institute in Woburn Square. I say appropriately because I think part of what we'll be talking about this evening are stories of migration, assimilation, acculturation, of the European Jewry and its cosmopolitan outlook, and what that has brought to the cultural and artistic life of London and beyond, the wider story of Britain as well. I should say that unfortunately our fourth panelist, Diana Davis, has suffered a power cut and has struggled to get online. So for now, we are with 3 panelists and myself. It may be that she connects during the talk and we'll weave her in if she does. We've got 3 terrific panelists with us today. We've got Martin Levy, chairman of H. Blairman and Sons, a dealership that many of you will know, specializing in 18th and 19th century furniture and decorative arts. Martin, you're the 4th generation of the firm?
Yes. Yes.
And Martin is also a member of the Spoliation advisory panel. We have Cherith Summers, who is a director at the art advisory Murphy and Partners, based in London, but has studied specifically a number of modern dealers who will be relevant to this conversation. She wrote a biography of Erica Brawson, a big supporter of Francis Bacon, and curated an exhibition about emigres in Britain in 2019. I was going to say last year, but I feel like we've lost 2 years, all of us. Alice Minter is the curator of the Rosalinde and Arthur Gilbert collection at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Previously worked with specialism in Objets de Vertu at Sotheby's in London. And Alice has been closely involved in the work that has happened at the Gilbert collection in thinking about provenance and indeed in curating new exhibitions from the collection. So what I've asked all of our speakers to do is to provide a couple of slides just to give us a visual prompt into this topic. I'd like all of them to speak for perhaps about 3 minutes each based on the images that they've provided. It will help to introduce them to you as well. And After that, we're going to have a conversation about some of the things that come up and some other things, and we will leave some time at the end for questions from our audience. If I can ask questions to use the Q&A box and to type out their questions in full, please do feel free to add questions during the panel. I will keep an eye on them. If they're relevant, I'll bring them in. But if they're new topics, I'll introduce them at the end of the hour. So I'm going to start off. In fact, I'm going to start off with 2 slides from our absent speaker, Diana, because I know that she wanted to just introduce some thoughts about familial networks where Jewish art dealers or art dealers of Jewish heritage or descent are concerned in London. She was going to focus on thinking about ideas of cousinhood on this slide. And I won't try to make the argument she was going to make, but certainly the sense that she wanted to raise of collaboration between family networks, sometimes competitive, but always based on a sense of shared heritage. And she wanted to also point out what she calls a secondary network of dealers trading with each other of Jewish heritage in London in the 19th century. The second slide, again, I won't try to be Diana, but she wanted to bring these slides related to the monument to the dealer Charles Davis in London, and to point out through the, I suppose, iconography of the monument to Charles Davis that there was somehow interesting questions raised about the difference between types of what you might call assimilation into of the British Jewry into a wider British culture or cultures, and the type of acculturation. I'm going to now move on. Martin, I'm going to turn to your first slide, if I may.
Thank you, Tom, and good evening to everybody. And thank you for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really going to try and describe very briefly my own heritage as an art dealer, so that you can perhaps get an idea of how I somehow fit into the picture of what we're going to speak about this evening. So on my paternal grandmother's side of the family, I'm descended from a man called John Coleman Isaac, who was a dealer first noted in 1815 in partnership with a man called Gabriel Davis. And I think it's interesting to note that Isaac, before he became a dealer in works of art, was actually a clothes salesman. And I think that says something about how many people, many immigrants found itinerant work when they first came to this country. So Isaac was based eventually by about 1828 in Wardour Street, a notable area for dealers in works of art, where he traded with well-known collectors from the period and also intertraded with other dealers and fed things into auctions. And that's a pattern that runs throughout 19th century brokerships. And Isaac retired eventually in the 1860s and retired and lived comfortably for the rest of his life. On the Blairman side of the family, I'm the great-grandson of, and can we have the next slide, Tom? Sorry, just before we go, the slide I showed before that, which I was totally ignoring, is Isaac's passport, and one from the 1850s, I think. Isaac traveled a lot, as many dealers did, buying on the continent, and I just wanted to show that with his British passport, and that part of his activity was traveling. So, sorry, next slide, Tom. This is a lifeboat parade outside my great-grandfather's shop in Llandudno, probably taken in the early 20th century. And the firm of Blairman was founded by the delightfully named Mr. Gesundheit and Mr. Blairman in 1884. operated for many years in Llandudno, holding auctions, dealing in this, that, and the other, nothing particularly notable. But very soon, and particularly in my grandfather's time, moved to Harrogate in Yorkshire and then to London. And then over the decades became, I think, reasonably noted dealers in works of art with a customer base across the world. Does that give you an idea, Tom?
That's really interesting, Martin. And I think you raised already some of the things that we want to dive into a bit more later, the relationship between, as it were, the legacy of successful European emigre Jews in commerce and how that's transferred into the trade of art. I think you've sort of also repeated my point in some way, but in a far more interesting form, about this being a British story and the way in which your family's firm was not just, I think, in Llandudno, but also in Harrogate. That's right, isn't it, Martin?
It was in Harrogate, and it was in Harrogate up until the 1950s, I think. Had a sojourn in New York at one stage as well. So it spread around. I think if I can quote all the president's men, it sort of followed the money to some extent. So I think there was a ready client base in Llandudno with holidaymakers from the Northwest in the late 19th century, Harrogate again a spa town, and London obviously as the capital.
Yeah, I see that leisure is one reason for these. Is when people have time for leisure, they have time to buy art. But of course, there are other important centres like Hull, where the Duvines were based for some time, that were important because they were places where you could bring things in, bring in goods. I'm going to move back because I see Diana has joined us. Can you hear me, Diana?
Yes, I can. Can you hear me?
Yes. So, Dan, I'm going to leap straight back to your slides, which I tried to give an overview of. But if you could give us your overview, that would be wonderful.
Sure. Well, this a three-generation dealership was founded by Frederick Davis in the 1850s. He'd married Elizabeth Falk, and by doing so, he had joined Eliza Falk. By doing so, he joined into an antique dealing dynasty. And there were lots more intermarriages, and they linked this family to the Joseph Stettiner, Wertheimer, and Jonas family. Originally, he was a tailor, but he was no doubt encouraged to change his trade by his father-in-law, and he founded a highly successful three-generation dealership, which reached its apogee in between 1880 and 1914 under his son Charles. This commercial cousinhood of Jewish dealers points to a sub-network, if you like, where dealers traded with one another. It also led to more accusations that Jews were dominating the art trade. The firm brokers the divide between the Jewish and the secular worlds, and the plutocrats and the aristocrats. When you get to the 1880s, it's a very difficult time, a huge socio-economic churn, and as land values are decimated, so assets are dispersed. And the Jew is the successful middleman, well, all dealers are, and they come in for a lot of hostility at this time. Edward VII makes Charles art expert to the king, and his clientele is very elite. It includes the Rothschilds, the Romanovs, the Dukes of Marlborough, and Norfolk, and also William Hesketh Lever. But Charles's closest friendship is with Alfred de Rothschild. He visits Halton, Alfred's country house, 86 times. And I think this is a shared love of art and also a shared cultural imprinting between the two men. And if we could have the next slide, please. This is really to show that the Davis family are acculturated, but they never assimilate. They attend first the Western Synagogue and then the Central Synagogue. Members of the family play an important part in communal life. And at Charles's funeral in 1914 at Willesden Cemetery, and you can see the Rothschild plot on the right, and then this lime tree walk, and Charles Davis is buried literally opposite the Rothschilds, everybody attends. You get members of the royal household, you get Jewish dealers. And we have a very nice vignette from the dealer Frederick Rathbone, who says to Lord Lever, actually, "I did not know Mr. Charles Davis was ill, or I should have gone to see him. Last time I saw him at Christie's, some 7 weeks ago, he sat next to me and outbid me. A very large attendance at his funeral, the first Jewish ceremony I had seen. Very simple." And to me, this just explains the fact that however acculturated the Jew was, he still remained to others exotic and somehow different. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Diana. You did them a lot more justice than I did 15 minutes ago. You've raised some really important points about perception, hostility, about Jewish identity, insofar as there is one Jewish identity, but obviously likely there are many different ways of thinking as a Jew of oneself, as through ethnic, religious, social, cultural affiliations and beliefs. I'm really interested that you raised the point of the places of worship as well, because I think that might be something interesting to come on to, the sense in which different types of Jewish rite and religious practice are reflected or not by some of the dealers we talk about. Cherith, I'm going to zip forward to your slides. No, I'm sorry, Alice, you're first.
Yeah, thank you, Thomas. And well, thank you as well for inviting us tonight inviting me to be one of the panelists. I'm not descendant of such prestigious, dynasties of art dealers. I'm simply curator of the Gilbert collection at the V&A. So Gilbert collection in itself would be a whole topic. But I think that what I just would like to explain, and this slide, what they highlight is because I'm curator of the Gilbert collection, and Arthur Gilbert was extremely involved in Jewish philanthropy, I think that his collecting habit, he wanted also to place himself in that long lineage of important and eminent Jewish art collectors, Rothschild, being the top in terms of decorative arts, because that's why he collected. And we do have a lot of Rothschild objects from Alfred de Rothschild and other branches and members of the family in the Gilbert collection. But studying that, then I thought about, but what about the rest of the V&A? And that's how I started then looking into the contribution of Jewish art dealers and also donors to our public institution. And two names really that I wanted to highlight tonight. So the first name is the Durlake brothers. So Henry and George Durlake, active in 1850s and until 1938 in London. Then the New York branch continued. And they really shape up the core collection of the museum. And it's interesting because we have to think that the first decades of the museum was actually, today we've got more than 1 million objects, but it really took time to build that. And at the time, the museum had only limited selection of objects and collection that they actually owned. And the rest, whenever they were putting exhibition, they were entirely relying on private collectors to lend to them for specific exhibition. The one that we have in mind is the 1862 exhibition, which was so popular that it lasted for a year, but was entirely relying on private collectors because the museum didn't have enough to show to the public. But Henry and George Durlake were really key to build the core of the V&A collection. And so they sourced amazing pieces of, as you can see here, medieval and Renaissance, Maiolica, but also portrait miniature. And I wanted to, if you can go to the next slide, please. The first, the key objects, which are still so important and so iconic for the V&A, are on the left, the Holbein cabinet, which had belonged to William Beckford. And so the top is 16th century, the bottom is a 19th century embellishment and stand. And then on the left, you've got the bust of Charles II, which was actually given by Henry Durlaquet. As we know that art dealers had their stock and collect, but also their own private collection. And that bust is, it's really important size. And it recently figured in the Baroque exhibition at the Tate Britain. It's really one of the most iconic piece of Baroque sculpture in the British collection. So they are really, really important. And they are not necessarily, well, apart from our website, there is nothing in the galleries that would address this contribution. And then the other name who I wanted to highlight as well today is Murray Marks. Murray Marks is really important for a few reasons. He was a partner of Durlaquet. He was really the one who introduced this fashion, this frenzy for blue and white Oriental porcelain. And he advised the museum, but he also advised his friends who were Whistler and Rossetti as well. So all these really important painters of the time. And Rossetti actually painted his trade card, Murray Marks trade card, with a lovely peacock feather and a blue and white porcelain. And on the right, you have a remarkable pair of Torofiniol and mantle, which were acquired by the museum in 1870. And what is interesting, and that's where I will end, is that we've got amazing Jewish dealers who really contributed to the core collection of the V&A. But what is interesting is that they, apart from the remark, they didn't much contributed to the V&A, to the collection of the V&A Judaica. However, the V&A itself actively collected Judaica from a very early period. And they were actually the very first public institution in Britain, in Europe, and we could even say in the world, to actively collect Judaica for their aesthetic value rather than religious. So there's a lot to say in 3 minutes, but that's all what I wanted to highlight through this slide.
We will come back, certainly. Thanks, Alice. We will come back certainly to thinking about, well, one thing you've pointed out there in relation to the V&A collection is how important it is to avoid essentializing Jewish taste or something like this. You've shown a wide range of objects from a wide range of places, and also that very interesting contrast with the Torah finials there too. And I think you've also raised the question of the sense in which these are stories of dealers who had arrived in Britain, in some cases, sometimes second or third generation, but whose stories haven't properly been told, and the question of why that might be. Cherith, I'm going to move on to your images now.
Thank you. Thank you again for having me. My interest in this topic comes much further forward in time. I came at this backwards, where I used to work for the estate of Francis Bacon, and through that came across Erica Browson, his first dealer, and from that really discovered the import of emigre art dealers, the vast majority of whom were Jewish, in post-war London, into shaping what we think of as modern British and post-war British art. And that's kind of my interest in this. So there were two quotes that I have read that I felt really encapsulated what I find very fascinating in this. The first is Brian Robertson, when he wrote in a book called Private View, which was a 1960s publication kind of trying to survey the British art world as it was at the time, where he said, "Thank heaven for the continental influx of hardworking and imaginative professionals in English cultural life." And this was then supplemented. John Russell subsequently said, it is largely true to say that new masters need new men to get them across. In London after the war, the pioneering was done in the main by firms newly founded. Now, those firms, so many of them were founded by Jewish art dealers. And I think it's fascinating to see how what we conceive of as British art owes so much to these people who were largely emigres and pretty new to Britain themselves. So starting with Annalee Judah, for example, she obviously is a champion of some of our greatest artists. Hockney is a really wonderful example, and you could look at Riley as well. But here you're seeing her with Mondrian. I think that's a fascinating thing to look at. Annalee came here and really was a very intellectual dealer who focused a lot on educating the British public. And one of the great things that she focused on educating on were non-representational artists. The Bauhaus and De Stijl were two of the topics that she focused on particularly. But when we think of artists like Nam Gabo, whom whenever you see a modern British auction catalogue or survey book, always will be mentioned there. Annalee Judah was one of the great champions. Now, Nam Gabo is also an emigre himself, but I think that that's a really interesting angle to look at. Can I have the next slide, please? And then the next, again, just thinking of particular champions, but there are many beyond this. I was thinking of the Gampelfies, who were phenomenal champions of two things in particular. One was British abstraction, which was a particularly tough battle to fight. The British taste was not for abstraction at the time, while across the pond in New York, that was kind of building a lot of steam. Here, collectors weren't necessarily so receptive. The Gampels were some of the biggest champions for the British abstract artists. So when you think of Sandra Blow, etc., the Gampels tended to be the ones who were championing them. The other thing that they did particularly well was sculpture. And when we think of some of the most British, if you will, sculptors, the Gampels tended to be the ones who'd given them their first exhibitions, their most significant exhibitions. Between the Gampels and Marlborough, also run by two Jewish art dealers, Barbara Hepworth was largely supported to create some of the most important things that we think of in her oeuvre. But not just her, there were many more beyond that. Reg Butler is another great example. You know, when I look at these dealers, what I think is just so exciting is how much British taste, and really the most exciting period of British art within the past maybe 150 years, the part that has made the biggest impact on an international scene, how much it owes to these emigre dealers and to their kind of championing something a little bit different to what was normally seen here.
Thank you so much, Cherith. That's a really interesting perspective. And this sense of cosmopolitanism, of aesthetic risk, might be something we could talk more about later. I mean, you raise a point, and you mentioned Gampelfies, you mentioned the foundational of Marlborough Gallery. We could talk about S.J. Phillips. We could talk about Danny Katz. We could talk about scores, if not hundreds, of leading dealerships here in the period we're talking about. And yet, for some reason, we're talking, we're distinguishing the Jewish contribution to art dealing from art dealing somehow as a more holistic perspective. And let me start by asking Diana how far it's important and necessary to distinguish that contribution from a more holistic historical perspective. Is it necessary at this point?
I think if you'd asked me the same question about the earlier period, which I studied rather more, I would have said there are issues about dealers and money and the difference between the beauty of art and the grubby commercial world that sometimes focus on the Jew. William Beckford calls Robert Fogg, who's actually a staunch Roman Catholic, sort of dirty pest of a Jew. But this question, and I don't know what Martin thinks about this, but this question becomes hugely relevant when you get to the 1880s, because there is a great economic downturn. And when there is a great economic downturn, and this is coupled with a huge influx of impoverished Jews from Eastern Europe who are not welcome. And they're not welcome by the Jews who are already established there either, because they've made their nest and they're very happy, thank you. But people look for a scapegoat. And you have this very weird mix where Edward VII is extending a hand of welcome to Jews, partly because he has a very extravagant lifestyle and they help him solve his money problems, and they can also entertain him in the way to which he has become accustomed. So there's a huge amount of hostility towards Jews, and then they become more prominent, and it gets all mixed up with the new money, plutocratic new money. So I think it does become really quite relevant.
Martin, do you want to take up the question of this sense in which, I think I watched Mark Westgarth's lecture on the geographical distribution of dealers of Jewish origin or descent, or Jewish dealers in London in the late 19th century, and I mean, of course, the wonderful map that he showed in that lecture suggests that somewhere above 30%, at sometimes probably more, of the dealers in the Bond Street area were Jewish or of Jewish heritage. Do you feel, Martin, that this is a sort of an important distinction to make at this point?
I think it's a subject that, in my view, is really worth examining. The figures you've just cited, 30 or 40% of whom were Jewish, that suggests there's another 60 or 70% who are not. And I think my question with this is always, Diana has studied the history of this far more deeply than I have. I'm coming to it, and as you know, and as Diana knows, I'm becoming increasingly interested in it. I think the question for me remains at the moment, to what extent is making these distinctions in the 19th century really that important? What strikes me as being slightly more interesting is how these characters came into the trade. In all areas contributes. Those who've done things which serve public benefit one way or another, as Durlacher did with the V&A, for example, rather than isolating them by this narrow distinction of what faith or otherwise they were born to or practiced. I mean, it's a very personal view, and it's one that I would say is somewhat, there's plenty of room for me to examine this more deeply.
I'm going to just stick, I will come back to you both, Alice and Cherith, soon, but I just want to ask Diana another question, because it's really focused on the 19th century work that she's done, which is just to give a broad overview, although it will necessarily be a simplification of some of the socio-economic factors that meant it was possible for Jewish dealers to have so much success in the art trade.
Well, they're barred from the professions and from the universities until 1875 with the ending of Jewish disabilities. And of course, as with the nonconformists, particularly the Quakers, this has a huge difference. They're necessarily forced into things like banking and commerce, and they become very good at it. They're also traders. They're also used to migrating from country to country. They're used to forming networks, and all these things are important. I mean, I think if we look at a dealer from whom Martin is descended, John Coleman Isaac, he will go on trips abroad for 2 or 3 months at a time, taking in a lot of countries, and that is quite important. They often very good with their hands in making things. Wertheimer was a bronzier, and he promoted himself as a bronzier rather than as dealer until almost the end of his life. That's Samson I'm talking about. There have always been a lot of Jews in the jewelry trade because these are portable assets, and sometimes you need to leave a country in a hurry, and a lot of decorative art is easy to put in your pocket, or some of it is, and carry it with you. And I think that the Talmudic heritage refines the memory And memory is quite an important asset for a dealer. You need to know where you've seen things, who has them, what price it fetch, what price it might fetch. So I think all these factors combine.
And I'm going to leap ahead to think about to bring in Cherith here as well. A lot of the figures you're talking about, they're emigres in the late 1930s or at the start of the war. I mean, do you find comparable factors for their success as the picture that Diana's spelled out in the late 19th century?
Well, I think the thing that I'm hearing you say, which I definitely felt was something I've seen when I've been doing my research, is the idea of network building. It's patently clear from many of these dealerships that sprung up at that time that they were closely interconnected. I think the one exception that we're all aware of is Marlborough, which maybe the other galleries didn't quite like so much because they were a bit more competitive. But generally speaking, there was a really strong network, both inside London, and I would say actually, and this is maybe the more critical thing, outside London. And what maybe defined these dealerships and made them, I think, so successful in doing what they did was that they opened a possibility for British artists that had not necessarily existed previously in just how much they were able to open an international world of exhibiting that had not, British artists really struggled to make a living from their work in any significant way up until kind of the mid last century. They weren't paid in the same way that their European counterparts were. That often meant that they had to teach rather than devote themselves to art. And they also could not necessarily get the same exhibiting opportunities. And then these dealers come along, many of them with legacies behind them in Europe of dealing families who taught them the way that the Europeans did it, which was much more professionalized, I would say. And then they came here, had these existing networks, and were able to use that platform to promote art in a way that it would not otherwise have been promoted. So I absolutely see connections.
It's really interesting. It's a story, obviously, of many obstacles to a group or groups of people, but also one of opportunities for exchange. And what you suggest, that we're not only talking about the trade of goods and portable goods, but actually the exchange of ideas, and not only the import of ideas, but the re-export of ideas.
Definitely, yeah.
Alice, you brought in this really interesting material about the relationship between art dealers, Jewish art dealers, and the development of museum collections, and the sense that there's a lot of work to do on the V&A collection, and no doubt on other collections in this country from that perspective. I mean, why do you think that none of that work has been sort of done before? It's a gap in research.
That is a very good question. The National Gallery has now, there is a student called Isabelle Muir, who is now their PhD student, and she is looking into Jewish donors, agents, and trustees of the National Gallery in that specific period. And it's something that I've started working on for the V&A. I think my first approach would like to actually look into the V&A committees. For example, Isidor Spielmann was one of the governors of the V&A. He was the instigator of the Anglo-Jewish exhibition, and he donated ultimately a few pieces to the museum. But was he the only one? That is something that I need to work on. Was he isolated among non-Jewish committee, and whether it's coming from that as well, and there is the other question as well, but if that is the case, why and how the V&A even started actively acquiring Judaica? So these are a few questions which I really want to explore. So for the moment, I can't really answer, but there is definitely, I think it must be coming from the tradition of committee and whether the Anglo-Jew community was represented or not at the committee of the VA. I'm talking for the VNA at least. Yeah.
There's an interesting question that's already in the Q&A box, actually, Alice, about the sense in which curators. Have you found any in your research any Jewish curators who were responsible for Judaica?
No, absolutely no. So there was one person called Michael Key, who in 1991 published the only catalogue that we have about the VNA Judaica. And that's it. And then there was never been any curator for Judaica specially. It was part of the remit of the metalwork department, like where I am sitting as well. And whoever was interested would just take this on board as well. So no, there has not been anything like this.
I mean, one interesting thing is the suggestion that actually what the V&A is doing, collecting Judaica, is it becomes a first museum to take it seriously as decorative art rather than as purely as religious functional objects that may also be very beautiful and finely crafted and valuable. And I suppose that's an interesting almost case study for thinking about almost a lot of what we're talking about, the ways in which things become either acculturated or assimilated. Martin, I want to turn back to you because in a sense we've been talking about dealers who have worked with museums or sold objects to museums. And I just wanted to sort of think about a broader context of thinking about Jewish art dealers in the public realm, and particularly philanthropic contexts. I mean, is that something that for you is quite striking, and perhaps it's something that's in your family has been important historically in previous generations?
Yes, I think it has been very important to my family. I think given that I've tried to explain that the sort of family history spans 200 years, clearly the approach probably went from desperation, maybe it's come to desperation now, I don't know. But, you know, it started as a much more humble pursuit at the very beginning. And I think if you look at, and I don't really want to talk about our firm particularly, but I mean, if you look, for the sake of argument, at my grandfather and what he did during the 40s and 50s, I think he was quite successful in what he did professionally, had customers around the world, but he certainly worked with the V&A. And I think if you look back at the files in the V&A, you'll find not only things that were acquired through the firm, but were given by the firm. And I remember there's an article from the 1950s, I think, or early 60s, in the Connoisseur, written about a group of furniture that had been presented by Philip to the V&A. So I think that was important to him. And I think that given that we all have so much in common, whether it's on the museum side, the collecting side, the market side, I think we do all work very well together. I think trust is absolutely key and central to that. And where that exists, it's a very happy marriage of interests. And so I think that, yes, it's very important to me to give back as well as to receive from that part. I just want to, if I can just go back onto one thing that Alice said. She talks about the V&A having had a sort of specific collection of Judaica as an isolated thing, but there not having been a specific curator. It seems to me that that is actually wholly appropriate, that it should be collected within a cultural context of the times and assimilated into the V&A's collections, rather than set on one side as something different.
However, yes, I agree with that. No, but then I have a question. Sorry, Tom. But then I have a question is also, and that's something that I really want to look into, is great, but what does that mean as well of people's conception of the Jewish history and aesthetics and rituals? And my big question, which is part of the art time, the art market in the 19th century, is that we know they were producing some fakes. So for example, you've got wedding rings that just came up saying, oh, well, that's typical of the Jewish rituals. And actually, the majority are fakes, and the majority were not used. So where is that coming from? And I spoke to my colleague Eloise Donnelly, who I'm hoping she's attending today, but she's been working on the history of collecting in the 19th and 20th century and the Waddesdon bequest. And she did say that it's the same. You've got some Judaica, which actually is catalogued as Judaica, but is not. It's so there is that as well. Is who, and I want to put that is who was putting that collection together, and what was their expectation, what were their conception of the Jewish life and ritual to then build up something. And it's fascinating. And indeed, was then, philo-Semitism, or was he also not an anti-Semitism? That'd be a bit too strong, but, what were they thinking behind that? So that's
Alice, I think one of the things that is sort of really interesting there is that certain things might obviously all objects can have many meanings and they change meanings as they move contexts, often or usually, if not always. But the suggestion that actually, to some degree, if fakes or sort of inauthentic works are being produced, that there was somehow a market for almost a proto-ethnographic collection of things related with the Jewish people. And that's sort of an interesting kind of crossover. In fact, it brings me back to Diana, because I did want to come back to this sense in which religious life and it was part of, for the dealers that you've studied, the networks that they were part of in the London Jewry. You mentioned two synagogues, the Great Synagogue and the Western Synagogue, which I think was opened about 1880, maybe slightly earlier.
No, it was actually earlier. The Western Synagogue that I'm talking about was not Western Marble Arch. It was in the Haymarket. And it was sort of refurbished in about 1850s, and then it was demolished. I'm not quite sure when.
Not the New West End. Sorry, I'm thinking of the New West End. And but I suppose then, were there particular groups of dealers who were part of particular congregations that you know of?
Oh gosh, I've really got no idea about that. I mean, obviously, my husband sometimes describes the synagogue as a men's club, and I'm sure you met many of your co-dealers in the interstices of being at synagogue, and nobody listens really, and everyone's talking. So I'm sure a lot of business was done on the side, still is. I was looking at the Isaac Falk papers today in the BM, and he talks about Alfred Sparrow, and I think Sparrow was also a member of the same congregation. What you see, this is a slightly different question, so I don't actually know the answer to your question.
I suppose I'm partly pointing out that actually there were major modern new synagogue buildings built in the West End of London in this period, and that in some senses the more quote unquote assimilated British Jewry and more established in the country and in the West End were both donors and users of those donors to and users of those buildings. The Central United Synagogue as well on Portland Street. But anyhow, let's move on from that and think about Cherith. Actually, I want to come back to you, and let's move again into the 20th century and think about. We've talked about Judaica and that tradition, but I wonder. Again, it might be far too simple a question. It's a difficult topic, but the extent to which any of the dealers that you've looked at also work to promote not just the work of British sculptors, but to introduce work by artists from the Jewish diaspora in this country.
I mean, it definitely happened. There's a couple of really interesting examples of that. The coolest example, I think, but just one which it's very hard to pin down, is there was a gentleman called Karl Braunschweig who'd been a dealer. He'd had a he'd had an auction house, I think, called the Kunsthaus Actuarius. I can't remember off the top of my head where it is in Germany, but anyway, that had been Aryanized and taken from him. He'd come to the UK. And in 1938, he held an exhibition in this paint supply shop on Oxford Street. I can't remember what it is now. I think, I don't remember. Anyway, it's you know, it's like a top shop now or something. And it was this exhibition of purely of Jewish artists. He had some really big names as patrons. It was hundreds. I think he had like 200 and something artworks. And that was, you know, that was conceived of as a way to get funds to people who were still trapped in territories that were controlled, generally speaking, by the Nazis, or that looked like they were going that way. That was a standalone exhibition. Another good example of it is the Arcade Gallery, which was run by the Vengraffs. It was Paul at the beginning. And that one opened pre-war, stayed open during the war. And they, although it's hard to piece this together, you know, there's not a ton of documentation necessarily, and they were certainly not best known for this. They were best known for Baroque and Mannerism, and subsequently a lot of African cultural artifacts. But during the time of the war, there is evidence to suggest that they were making a conscious effort to show, again, Jewish artists who were trapped in Nazi-controlled territories. And then if you look at it outside of that kind of angle, which in both cases was certainly one aimed at getting people money to get them out, you know, there's examples like Joseph Herman, for example, who was shown by Roland Brazen-del Banco. He's a hugely important artist, as a Jewish artist who came here and then really, really influenced a lot of the young modern British greats. We would consider them now. You know, when you think of Robert McBride and Robert Colquhoun, or John Minton or Lucian Freud, when they saw Joseph Herman and Yankel Adler, two artists who were shown by Jewish dealers here in London at the time, they were very influenced by their work, and it really changed what they did afterwards. So there is definitely evidence to support it. I would say it's not, aside from the examples I've mentioned, not like hugely widely documented, but maybe there's more.
I wonder earlier with the Ben-Uri Art Society, where there's a sort of an involvement between collaborations between artists and associations of artists, Jewish artists, and their path to market.
I couldn't speak to that for certain, I'm afraid.
That's for another panel.
Yes.
Let me ask you, before I take a handful of questions, Martin, I wanted to ask you about, perhaps, obviously I'm asking you because you're on the Spoliation Advisory Panel, but thinking about the involvement that Jewish art dealers have had, to your knowledge, in the restitution of Nazi looted cultural property in the post-war period. I know that we're covering it 2 centuries and there's a lot to get in, but it seems like a whole other perspective on this subject.
I'm not sure that I really, and Jacques Schumacher, who works with Alice in the Gilbert collection at the V&A, one side or the other of that particular institution, has obviously done a lot of work on that in tracking things down. I think that since the Washington Conference, everybody has it front and center of the mind that works of art that might have moved from one collection to another during the 33 to 45 period need to be very mindful of those provenance questions. And there's no public institution in the world now that doesn't right up front want to have answers quite properly to those questions. And museums are also examining objects in their own collections and seeing how they can go about making good wrongs that had not been put right in the past. So I'm not sure that Jewish dealers any more than any other dealers are working actively on that. As you say, I've been very privileged to serve on the Spoliation Advisory Panel. But that is a panel not entirely made up of Jewish people. It's rigorous in the way decisions are made, and not all decisions decisions have gone in favour of claimants. And I suspect, I mean, I don't know, I have no idea why I was appointed, but I suspect it's as much as anything because I have some knowledge of the way the art market works and has worked in the past. So I think it's vital that all the players in the art market world and in the museum world work together to see that there are fair and just solutions as the rubric goes.
May I jump in? I do
course.
know of one thing, which was that Harry Fisher, who was one of the Marlborough founders, whenever he passed away, this will be something you'll be very familiar with, Elise, his widow donated, they had an inventory of Entertainment Kunst, which she donated after his death to the V&A, and I think that was really instrumental in tracking down a lot of things that had been taken.
So indeed, if I may jump, my colleague Jacques Schumacher, as part of our council history display, which was highlighting a few objects which were restituted or not, but definitely had Jewish collectors or previous Jewish owners who suffered from persecution through the Nazi. The object might have been part of that or not, but that's the history that we wanted to tell. And Jacques Schumacher also then worked on this Antarctica list as well. And indeed, it was the first time that it was properly highlighted and we made a digital instrument of it. We thought only a few people are going to look at it because it was available on a terminal in the galleries. We had something like thousands of people sitting and going through. It's now available on the website. So if you go on the V&A website, you'll definitely find a whole article about it. But yes, absolutely, it was instrumental. And Harry Fisher, indeed, we still don't know how he got this list, but it's key for all that history of art which has been destroyed or sold or looted. So yeah.
We haven't got a lot of time left, so we're going to do a quick fire round on the questions, but let's try and get through a few of them. Let me pick out part of this question for you, Diana. Question about the acquisition of cultural objects and the extent to which that might have been identified in the Jewish community in London as a marker of, quote unquote, having arrived in the upper echelons of British society.
Well, yes, I mean, the acquisition of art objects, yes, certainly. I think it did confirm status. It confirmed, but it wasn't just for dealers, it was for all sorts of people. It was for sort of newly arrived plutocrats wanting to make, commercial people wanting to make their mark. I mean, Rothschilds building their fine houses or indeed anybody else, so.
I'm now going to go to Cherith with another question from Lavinia Davenport. I mean, art dealing did happen during the wars, but I'm going to just sort of twist this question a little bit and say, I mean, are there instances of dealers that you have studied facing hostility for dealing in Britain during the war? Sorry.
No. Is the short answer. I mean, not many of the ones I studied did. There were only a couple of examples who kept dealing through the war. Most of the firms I studied founded afterwards. The very cool examples are people like Jack Bilbo, for example, who it seems like people loved it and loved that they were dealing during the war and found it really amazing that they were able to connect with art and within the art world while everything was going crazy everywhere else. I haven't found any examples of people having difficulty during. I mean, plenty of the people whom I looked at, though, did end up in internment camps and in the Pioneer Corps before they were able to start dealing. So that may be one of the primary reasons they were not dealing during the war. They were not free to do so.
So there were certainly some obstacles there.
A few, yeah.
A quick one to finish for Martin about whether we go back to the beginning where we started, to John Coleman Isaac, and do you have a sense of his experiences traveling in post-Napoleonic Europe what sort of network he had with, for instance, German dealers who helped him?
Well, we do know a reasonable amount about it, which of course means we'd like to know much more. But there are certainly 3 surviving travel diaries that are in the Makata Library I think it's the Makata Library in Southampton. Is that down? Is it the Makata Library down there? The Hartley Library. It's the Hartley Library in Southampton.
Yep.
Yep. They've got those. And there are some letters that he writes to his wife, Sarah. So we do actually get quite an impression of the travails of crossing Europe and the ups and downs, the jealousies, the successes, the failures. And to answer the specific question, Tom, yes, I mean, he did have a network of dealers. He complained sometimes when rivals had got to that particular dealer first and not left anything, which, you know, is familiar to today. And it's a point I made recently in another talk. Dealing hasn't changed vastly. I mean, some things have changed, but the kind of the desire to succeed hasn't changed at all, and the desire to place things. And just specifically with Davis, his father-in-law, Gabriel Davis, was living in Fürth. So, you know, that was an on-site contact that he had. But he went, you know, from Northern Europe right down to Italy, Venice and places like that. So networks were very important.
Well, we're at the end of our hour, and we've scratched lots of surfaces, but fortunately, there will be a lot more work continuing on the subject of the Jewish country house in the 19th century, of which this symposium series is an aspect, looking at art dealers. And you can look on the Jewish Country Houses Project website and Twitter account. And it's also well worth looking out. Tom Stammers and Sylvia Davoli are going to be editing a book taken from papers that have been given at workshops and lectures on this particular facet of the Jewish Country Houses Project on Jewish dealers. So that will be coming out when it's ready. I would just say thank you very much to people who have given us really interesting comments in the Q&A, really helpful on Ben Uri, Parsons Gallery, Renee Gimple and others. And above all, say thank you to the speakers, Alice Minter, Cherith Summers, Martin Levy and Diana Davis. And London Art Week continues online and in the galleries tomorrow. So please do go and check it out. Thank you very much and good evening.